This presentation is on the cerebral hemispheres, and once again I'm going to divide it into two parts and cover a few slides in the first, and then I'll do the remaining in the next presentation. So let's look at the gross anatomy of the cerebral hemispheres. So as we all know, there are two cerebral hemispheres, one on either side, and they are separated in the middle by a fissure present, and that fissure is known as the longitudinal fissure. Each cerebral hemisphere is connected to the other by a band of white matter that actually passes through. And if you open this longitudinal fissure, you can see that band of white matter, which is known as corpus callosum. So it's called corpus callosum. And it connects, as you can see here, it connects the two cerebral hemispheres to one another. The corpus callosum does not extend right from the anterior to the posterior aspect. As you can see, the length of the corpus callosum, in other words, is not the same as the length of the cerebral hemispheres. It's only present in the middle, but you can see how its fibers actually flare out to go anteriorly and posteriorly, and from the middle they go right across. And we'll be doing this corpus callosum as we do the types of fibers, so we'll come back to it later. Next, we look at the surface of the cerebral hemispheres, and here we are looking at, this is called the superolateral surface, and this is the medial surface. The surface of the hemisphere is deeply furrowed by little fissures which are known as sulci. A single is known as a sulcus, and certain prominent sulci are the central sulcus, which is present pretty much in the center of the cerebrum. And then we have this lateral sulcus. This is actually called the posterior limb of the lateral sulcus. And we use some of these sulci to divide the hemisphere into lobes. We will be doing the other sulci which are present on the medial aspect too. And the reason why we have these sulci is, when the brain was initially developing, in primitive brains, the brain was extremely smooth, and the gray matter was present as islands in the core of the brain. Now the gray matter means that you have nerve cell bodies here. So depending on how many nerve cell bodies you have, you can make that many connections. As evolution progressed, much of this gray matter, if you remember, moved to the periphery. So that's where it formed the cortex. Now, to increase the number of collections, what happened is the brain started getting convoluted. So in the same area, so you can see that if I use the same area and I make these convolutions like this, now I can accommodate a lot more gray matter in the same area, and that calls for more connections. So that's the reason why we see so many of these sulci present in the human brain. The region between any two sulci is known as a gyrus. And again, these gyri are also named. The plural is gyri. So they are also named, and I'll be showing you some of these which you will need to know. Now, while we are on this picture, let's also look at the corpus callosum. So when you look at the corpus callosum from the top, it just looks like a band of white matter present here, connecting the two cerebral hemispheres. But when you take a section through, a sagittal section as has been taken over here, you will notice that actually this corpus callosum has different parts to it. The anteriormost part, which is here, is known as the rostrum of the corpus callosum. Then this corpus callosum bends, and where it bends, that area is known as the genu, which is followed by the body. And then at the posteriormost part, you have a rounded projection which is known as the splenium. Now we use this to tell which is the anterior end and which is the posterior end. Suppose you just got this picture like this, and let's say you didn't have the cerebellum. how would you tell which is the anterior end of the hemisphere and which is the posterior end? You will notice that the distance between the splenium and the occipital pole, this area here is the occipital pole, the distance between the splenium to the occipital pole is greater than the distance from the genu to the frontal pole. So this here is the frontal pole. So that helps to tell you. So let's say you got an image like this and you were asked to identify something. You first have to get your bearings right. So in order to know which is the anterior and which is the posterior part, you just look at the genu and the splenium. So this distance is shorter than this distance, apart from the fact, of course, that it looks different. Let's now look at the lobes and how the lobes of the cerebrum are divided. And then we'll also see the cavity up here, which you see, which is the lateral ventricle. Now, in order to divide the cerebral hemispheres into lobes, we take certain landmarks. One is the central sulcus. The second is this lateral sulcus, or this is also called the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, because this lateral sulcus actually begins on the medial aspect that way. And then we take another little sulcus. We see only a small part peeping out, which is called the parieto-occipital sulcus. So we use these three sulci. The central sulcus is the longest uninterrupted sulcus present on the supralateral surface in the superior part, and it's usually seen somewhere in the middle. It actually begins on the medial surface. So it really begins on the medial surface, comes on to this lateral surface, and it's uninterrupted. And it almost but doesn't quite come up to this lateral sulcus. So this is the central sulcus. So here we have the central sulcus. Then this is the lateral sulcus. So we join the central to the lateral sulcus. So artificially join the central to the lateral sulcus. Then here we have the parieto-occipital sulcus. So we just see a little bit peeping on this lateral side. And then on the inferior border of this cerebral hemisphere, if you look at this inferior border of the cerebral hemisphere, you'll notice that there is a slight notch present here. This is called the pre-occipital notch. So this is known as the pre-occipital notch. So from this point, if we extend an artificial line backwards to the parieto-occipital sulcus and then extend this lateral sulcus backwards this way, then we get 4 lobes. The part in front of the central sulcus and above this lateral sulcus is the frontal lobe. The part behind the central sulcus, above the lateral sulcus, and in front of this artificial line that is from the parieto-occipital to the pre-occipital notch, this is the parietal lobe. The part behind this artificial line drawn from the parieto-occipital sulcus down to the notch is the occipital lobe. And this area below the lateral sulcus and above this inferior border and in front of this line, that is the temporal lobe. So that's how we divide the lobes. So we use the central sulcus, bring it down to the lateral sulcus, extend the lateral sulcus backwards, and it joins a line which goes from the parieto-occipital to the pre-occipital notch. So that's how we have these lobes. Some people also describe a lobe which is the insular lobe. I don't use that. Sometimes you might find it, but so just in case, so that you don't get confused, the insula is a place, is an area which, if you were to take the lips of this lateral sulcus and you open them out, as has been done here, you'll find an area buried deep inside, and that is called the insula, and this is connected with visceral functions. So just so that you don't get confused if you hear about it somewhere. Now the blunt ends of the hemisphere, you have two blunt ends anteriorly and one posteriorly. So this anterior most one is the frontal pole. Below it, facing anteriorly, is the temporal pole. And then on the posterior aspect, this is the occipital pole. So you have three poles while you have four lobes. Now the cavity of the cerebral hemisphere, if you remember, is the lateral ventricle. Now this lateral ventricle is the cavity, but that means the cavity has to be present in all lobes. So in order to be present in all lobes, this cavity is actually C-shaped. The cavity is somewhat like this, like a C. And if you look at this, and here this image here is showing you the two lateral ventricles. The part which is present in relation to the frontal lobe is called the frontal horn, or also known as the anterior horn. The central part is known as the body. The central part, or also called the body. Then we have a part which goes towards the occipital lobe, so that's called the occipital horn, or also known as the posterior horn. And then we can see a part which is coming down inferiorly, and that inferior part is called the temporal horn, or known as the inferior horn. So we have an anterior horn present in the frontal lobe, the body which is present in the frontal and the parietal lobe, a posterior horn present in the occipital lobe, and an inferior horn present in the temporal lobe. So you must know where these horns are present. Let's now look at the important sulci and gyri which have been described in your notes. So here we are looking at the sulci and gyri present on the supralateral surface. So I'm going to use your notes. So let's look at the frontal lobe. So if you remember, I mentioned that the central sulcus was the longest uninterrupted sulcus, and it begins on the medial aspect. It actually begins on the medial aspect. So here in the frontal lobe, you have four. In front of that central sulcus, you see a sulcus present, which is called the precentral sulcus. Anterior to that, you'll see two sulci present, which are known as superior and inferior frontal sulci. So you have the precentral sulcus, then you have the superior and inferior frontal sulci, and then I said there were four, so these are three. And then from the lateral sulcus, actually you have a kind of V-shaped sulcus. So you have two like these. These really belong to the lateral sulcus, and they are known as the anterior and the ascending rami of the lateral sulcus. So I've kind of grouped it as one because they kind of form a V like this. So it's known as the anterior and the ascending rami of the lateral sulcus. So these are the sulci which are seen in the frontal lobe. In the parietal lobe, the sulci that you see behind the central sulcus, you see this sulcus present, which is called the post-central sulcus. Just as you had a pre, now you have a post-central sulcus. And then somewhere in the center of the parietal lobe, you have a sulcus which goes right across, which is known as the intraparietal sulcus. In the temporal lobe, so let's go to the temporal lobe. You have two sulci present, a superior and an inferior temporal sulcus. This is on the supralateral surface. And in the occipital lobe, the important sulcus that you see is actually this one, which is called the lunate sulcus. And the lateral occipital is really not that important. The lunate sulcus is one of the more important ones. So these are the sulci seen on the supralateral surface. Let's now look at the gyri which you see. In the frontal lobe, between the precentral sulcus and the central sulcus. So between this precentral sulcus and the central sulcus, this gyrus which you see, this is called the precentral gyrus. This is a very important gyrus. This is the motor area from where all your corticospinal, corticonuclear fibers started. So this is the precentral gyrus. Then you have these two sulci, the superior and inferior, and they divide this part of the frontal lobe into three gyri. The superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. So you have superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyrus. The parietal lobe. So let's look at the parietal lobe. Between the central and the post-central sulci, this gyrus which is present is called the post-central gyrus. This is the one where your sensory information relays. So all the sensory information went to thalamus. From the thalamus, this is where it comes. Then we have an area above the intraparietal sulcus. The part above is known as the superior parietal lobule. The part below is divided into two. You have one which is known as supramarginal gyrus, and there's this other part which is known as the angular gyrus. The supramarginal gyrus is for language, and we'll see that, and the angular gyrus is used in spatial relations. So we'll be talking about this when we do the functions. So we have post-central, superior parietal lobule, supramarginal, and angular. So those are the gyri present in the parietal lobe, and you need to know these. You need to know all the gyri that I'm mentioning. In the temporal lobe, on the supralateral surface, the two sulci divided into three gyri. You have a superior, a middle, and an inferior temporal gyrus. The superior temporal gyrus, this area is where your auditory pathway resides, your auditory function resides. The lateral lemniscus, finally, from all the way it goes and ends up in the medial geniculate body. From there it will go to this auditory cortex. So this is where it is present. It has other functions too, which we'll do as we go along. And then the occipital lobe. So this area is the occipital lobe, somewhere here, about this much. This, on the lateral surface, you have that lunate sulcus. That lunate sulcus really kind of covers an auditory association, a visual association area, not auditory, visual. So this entire part here, there is no specific gyrus really, but this entire occipital lobe is to do with vision, and we'll again you've already seen it when you did the visual pathway, so that's what is important, and its main gyrus is seen on the medial surface. So these are the gyri and sulci seen on the supralateral surface. Let's now look at the gyri which we see on the medial and the inferior surfaces. And this actually needs to be corrected. And so let me do that right here. So gyri on the medial and inferior surfaces. So let's look at the medial surface. On the medial surface, you'll see a little bit of this central sulcus. Remember, I told you it started on the medial surface. So it starts here and then goes it'll go on the lateral side. So you have, surrounding this central sulcus, you have an area of the frontal lobe and you have an area of the parietal lobe. So this gyrus which is present here is known as the paracentral lobule. So this gyrus is called the paracentral lobule. It has part of the precentral gyrus and it has part of the postcentral gyrus. So this paracentral lobule contains both motor and sensory parts. So you have the the postcentral gyrus spills over on the medial aspect and the precentral gyrus also spills over on the medial aspect. So that's what I meant by you see both the motor and the sensory parts in the paracentral lobule. Then you see a very important sulcus which is known as the cingulate sulcus. So this sulcus going up like this is called the cingulate sulcus, and below it and above the corpus callosum is this gyrus which is called the cingulate gyrus, and I have mentioned this cingulate gyrus quite frequently, and this cingulate gyrus is connected to the limbic system. Then on the medial surface you see a very deep sulcus or fissure present, which is known, this one here, which is known as the calcarine sulcus. And from this calcarine sulcus you have a sulcus which goes up like this, that is known as the parieto. This one is the parieto-occipital sulcus. So this one is the parieto-occipital because it's between the parietal and the occipital lobes. So this is the parieto-occipital sulcus, and this is the one which you saw peeping on the lateral surface. In between these two is an area which is called the cuneus, and this part belongs to the occipital lobe. So this cuneus belongs to the occipital lobe. The area in front of the cuneus is called precuneus. On the inferior aspect, so when you're looking at the inferior aspect, so here you can see part of the frontal lobe. This area here is part of the temporal lobe, and this is part of the occipital lobe. So up here on the frontal lobe you will see a sulcus present here on which this olfactory bulb is lying. That sulcus is known as the olfactory sulcus, and this is the olfactory bulb which is to do with olfaction or smell. Then you have little orbital sulci which divide it into four parts like this. So this area, part of it is temporal, so this divides this orbital surface into four regions. Then the other important sulcus which you see is this occipito-temporal sulcus, which is present here going from the occipital to the temporal lobe, and this divides the area, this entire inferior surface, into two gyri. One is called the lateral, this is the lateral, and this is the medial, occipito-temporal gyri. So you have a lateral and a medial occipito-temporal gyri. Then another sulcus present here is called the collateral sulcus, and just medial to the collateral sulcus is again a very important area which belongs to the limbic system, which is known as the parahippocampal gyrus. So we have the cingulate gyrus and the parahippocampal gyrus, which were related to the limbic system. On the temporal lobe, this medial most part here, this is known as the uncus, and this is important because this is where, if you notice, you can see this olfactory bulb, it comes down and becomes the olfactory tract, and that actually comes and relays on in the uncus. So the uncus is to do with olfaction, and this is also connected to the limbic system. So these are the sulci and gyri which are seen on the medial aspect. Now let's look at functional areas. Now the entire cerebral cortex is not the same throughout. It's not uniform throughout. So if you take you take a microscopic view of the cerebral cortex from the motor cortex, from the sensory cortex, from the auditory cortex or the visual cortex, you will find that it differs. And also what has happened is, because of this difference, people started numbering the areas differently, and these numbers were done by a person known as Brodmann. And based on this microscopic structure, he kind of gave the areas different numbers, and then we assign functional significance to these numbers. For example, number 4 we say is the motor area, number 312 is the sensory area, area 44, 45 is for motor speech. So we use these areas, we use some of these Brodmann's numbers to say what the function of that area is. Now, one important concept that you must understand, that the body is represented on the cerebral hemisphere in an upside down fashion, which means that for, say, the motor and the sensory areas, the face is represented lower down on the precentral gyrus, and for sensory, face is lower down on the postcentral gyrus. Then you have the neck and the upper limbs, then you have the lower limbs, and the legs and the perineal area are represented on the medial aspect up here in this paracentral lobule. So here we have the upper limb. So the same thing this way. So the perineal area and the the legs and the feet are represented in this paracentral lobule. And this is showing you that this is the picture of the body with its and the way the body is represented is the proportions are different for each aspect of the body. So this kind of disproportionate representation which you're seeing is known as a homunculus. When I say disproportionate, means disproportionate to what the body really looks like. So the homunculus really tells you that how the body is represented proportionally on the cortical surface, and the proportion which is given to a body's area depends on its function rather than its size. So for example, the tongue is a very small organ, but it has a large area of representation because it's functionally very important, because you use the tongue to taste, you use the tongue to swallow, you use the tongue to speak. So it has a lot of function. The thumb, for example, as compared to all the other fingers, the thumb is the most important digit. So the thumb has a greater area of representation compared to the other digits. Similarly, for the lips are used for speaking, for swallowing, well, at least, to put the food in your mouth. So, the face, for example, all of the face is very important. So you see how much area is given to the face, but look at the limbs, which are much larger, they are given very little areas. So you can see that this is the medial surface, and notice how the legs and the feet are represented on the medial surface, and then the rest of the body is represented on the lateral surface. So these are two important concepts that you must understand. That first, the body is represented in an upside down fashion, and secondly, the cortical representation is based on functional importance rather than size. So that is important for you to understand. And here this image just shows you the difference in the cortical areas. So you can see that this is the motor cortex and this is the sensory cortex. They have 6 layers, but in the motor cortex, for example, you see these large cells which are known as pyramidal cells, or also known as cells of Betz, and these give rise to, they don't form the majority of the cortex. You have other cells too, but you have a lot of these large and small cells, pyramidal cells, and these are the ones which give rise to the fibers, the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers. Now here I am showing you the functional areas and the numbers that we assign to them. The motor area, the primary motor area, you can see here is given the number 4, Brodmann's number 4. The primary somesthetic or sensory area is area 312. The motor speech area, which is also called Broca's area, which is responsible for how you speak. The spoken speech is areas 44 and 45. Then we have the auditory area present up here, area 41, 42. The visual cortex is area 17, and you can see here, and the association areas are areas 18 and 19. Now I also want you to look at the brain, and just to show you this and how the homunculus is. So I'm going to go to a slideshow view, and here we are going to do probe the brain. And so here's the probe the brain activity. So this is showing you the medial surface and then the superolateral surface. So here, if this is my probe, so notice if I probe on the medial surface, so you can see how the opposite foot on the medial surface is moving. So notice if I do it here, so again these are the legs, and if I go right here, see it's the eye. So I'm going to do it again. If you notice, so the eye up here, you can see that that's the lips, the eyes, thumb, and let's do that again. So you notice this opposite thumb. Let's do this side. So you can see the fingers. So you see each area has. So this is this shows you how the the homunculus is represented. And let's go back to our slideshow, and I also want to show you the homunculus. And just so that you can read it here. So this is just telling you that more of the cortex is assigned to certain areas as compared to others, and it's talking about sensory, but this holds true for motor functions also. So this is very interesting. This is a drawing of a person based on what you see. So this is, when I click continue, this is how the cortex uses it. So you can see that how the homunculus is represented. And so let's go back to our PowerPoint. So that's what I wanted to show you on this. Now let's go to the functions of the various lobes. So first we're going to look at the frontal lobe, and these are some of its main functions. First is it carries it is important because it is responsible for motor function. So the primary motor area, which is, remember I told you, was area 4, Brodmann's area 4. This is the one that channels commands for execution of movement. So this is the one which sends down the information for execution of movements to the lower motor neurons. And this controls voluntary activity of skeletal muscle in individual movements of different parts, and this is on the contralateral side. So that is important. I've been saying this all along, that the cerebral cortex controls the opposite side of the body. Next is the premotor and supplementary motor areas. These program skilled motor activity, and actually they direct the motor area, telling it what it needs to do. So this premotor and supplementary motor area are these areas which you see here. The supplementary is on the medial aspect, the supplementary motor area on the medial aspect. What they do is they generate programs for motor routines, and these are necessary for skilled voluntary activity, like for example reaching for a pen, picking up something from the floor, kicking a ball, all of these. And this generation of programs for skilled voluntary action is done when a new program is established and when a previously learned program is altered. So for example, if you begin to learn how to play football, then a program will be generated in the premotor and supplementary motor area to carry out this function. Or let's say, for example, you are playing football and then you suddenly change the way you kick the ball or something. So it's a previously learned program is altered. So again, now that new program generation is done in the premotor and supplementary motor areas. The primary motor area is this one is the cortex through which commands are sent down for the execution of movements. But this premotor and supplementary motor areas, they program your skilled activity. So what they do is, after programming, is they direct the primary motor area in its execution. So they tell it, now how are you going to execute it, because I've decided that this is how it is to be done. So I'm now giving you the information and telling you how it needs to be done, and then this will send it down to the lower motor neurons. Now this premotor area has extensive connections with proprioception, sensory information, and visual information. So because of these connections, it has an integrated system for using all of this information in preparing somebody to do movements or in the preparation of movements. So that's premotor area is extremely important. Then we have the frontal eye field, which is this area here, and this frontal eye field is important in scanning movements, when you're scanning a particular area. And this is also used in the accommodation reflex, that is when you look at something at a distance and then you come and look at something really close by, your eyes accommodate to looking at that object close by. So that is known as the accommodation reflex, and you did it in the visual pathway, and if you remember, you use this frontal eye field. Then we have the Broca's area, the area 44-45. This is the motor speech area used for expressive speech. That means the words that come out of your mouth. And this is located, as you can see, in the inferior frontal gyrus. And it uses, your muscles of larynx, tongue, mouth, soft palate, etc. And that's why we say it is expressive speech. That means what comes out of your mouth. So you're expressing yourself. So that is known as expressive speech. Then this area here, which is known as the prefrontal cortex. So this is called the prefrontal cortex. This is very, very important. It has extensive connections with other lobes, and it is responsible for personality, initiative, judgment, decision making. So it has a lot of connections. So let me just tell you all the things that this prefrontal cortex can do. It is important for personality, for decision making, emotional control, the fact that you can control yourself, you don't start weeping or laughing oddly, judgment, motivation, the fact that we can we know to use proper judgment, then attention and mood, and other functions are awareness. This is also very important. Control over your higher mental faculties, so that the decision that will come under decision making. So that's how you control your higher mental faculties, behavior. So these are all functions of the prefrontal cortex. It's extremely well developed in humans, and it's responsible for the makeup of an individual's personality and how they express themselves, how they control themselves, how they exercise judgment, and how this prefrontal cortex monitors behavior, And as I said earlier, it exercises control on higher mental faculties as judgment and foresight. For example, if you did something, what the consequences would be. That, so it has that on foresight. And cognition, understanding what the world is really all about. So all of this is controlled by the prefrontal cortex. Any damage to this prefrontal cortex will, all of this will go. So person's personality will change, their cognition will go, decision making will go, they will not have control on themselves, emotional control, how to behave in society, they have no foresight, they lose judgment, all of this. So you will see that when we do the lesions of the frontal lobe. And studies which have done show that thinking strategies change with age. And teenagers actually don't use the prefrontal cortex as much as we do, because the brain actually grows, and they see that myelination in the prefrontal cortex actually is completed in adulthood, whereas everything else sort of gets completed earlier on. Myelination in the prefrontal cortex takes a little longer to occur. So studies have shown that teenagers actually use a different part of their brain for judgment, and the part that teenagers use is known as the amygdala, which is present in the temporal lobe. And this amygdala is used mainly for gut reactions. And teenagers usually do something, when they react, they always say, what will I do in this situation? That's the way they react to a situation. Whereas an adult will, when they react to a situation, their reaction is, what will I do in this situation, and if I do this, how will it affect others? So that's your foresight that you have. Teenagers lack that foresight, and that's why their judgment is often impaired, and that's why parents are often so worried about teenagers. They ask them when you ask a teenager a question, what were you thinking? They really weren't thinking, because they're not using their prefrontal cortex. It hasn't developed as yet. They are using a different part of their brain, which is the amygdala. So, having this information, those of you who are parents, I think sometimes you need to give your teenagers, cut them a little slack because of this. Another important thing about the prefrontal cortex is, through its association fibers, association fibers are fibers which connect different areas of the brain to one another. This prefrontal cortex has access to sensory experience which is occurring now, and it has access to sensory information which occurred in the past. And it also has connections with the limbic system. So because of all of this, it forms a system that determines what your reactions will be to present day situations based on past experiences. So that's how it does that. And so you can see what an important area of the brain the prefrontal cortex is. Let's go to the next lobe, which is the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is the primary sensory area, which is lying in the post-central gyrus, area 312. This is the one which receives sensations of pain, touch, temperature, proprioception. And again, the size is based on functional importance and the need for sensitivity. So, certain areas are more sensitive than others. Like the dorsum of your hand is more sensitive than the palmar aspect. So that area has more representation. Then it has an association cortex, which is this area in the superior parietal lobule, called the somesthetic association cortex. And this is where all the data is integrated. So, using, for example, in stereognosis, without when your eyes are closed, you can tell what is there in your hand, and this is based on past experiences. And the information here can be interpreted, and recognition occurs. So that's what is there in the somesthetic association area. Then the sensory the parietal lobe is also important for appreciation of spatial relations. So you know where you are with relation to space and time, and the angular gyrus is one of the important gyri which is responsible for the spatial relationships. And you also, for example, you can differentiate the right from the left side of your body. Another area where spatial relations come into being is, for example, you go and park your car somewhere, so you know how to find your way to your car. Of course, in a huge parking lot you sometimes lose your way, but that's not because your brain's not working properly, it's just because the parking lot is so big. But then finding your way to a place, like in your house, you know where your bathroom is located, where the other areas are located. So you'll find that when someone has lesions of the parietal lobe, they lose this sense of spatial relations, and they can't find their way around. Then the parietal lobe is also important in the performance of learned movements done in a sequential manner. For example, you know how to button your coat, you know how to make a cup of tea, when you pour, or what you use first and what comes next. So that's very important. And this is important because how the parietal lobe does it is it integrates, there is an integration of different senses, and it allows for understanding a single concept. So for example, in buttoning your a jacket or something, you know how you should go about it. Or for example, making tea, you know what should be done. The water should be boiled first, then you put the tea leaves, and then how you pour the tea. So that's how this lobe is able to, it's responsible for doing all of this. The parietal lobe also is important for taste. Taste is represented here at the lower part of this post-central gyrus. So this is the area for taste perception. And then the other important thing is this Wernicke's area, which is receptive speech, or which is known as sensory speech. Broca's was called motor speech. This area is known as sensory speech, or understanding. You're receptive, that means you understand speech. So this is the part, this area here, which is present in the parietal and the temporal lobe. So this area is the Wernicke's speech area. So these are some of the functions of the parietal lobe. And just to show you a little article which appeared in the paper some time ago, this was about the angular gyrus, and it shows you this out of body experience that you have when you stimulate the different angular gyri. So when you stimulate the angular gyrus on the right side, it looks like you have a total out of body experience. When you stimulate the angular gyrus on the left side, it looks like somebody is lying right next to you. Here you're looking at yourself from the top. So this explains when people have parietal lobe malfunction, sometimes they ignore one side of their body totally, and the problem could be in this angular gyrus. So this was an interesting article. You can read it, and I won't go over this whole thing, but you can read it and see what's written in this. The next lobe is the temporal lobe, and amongst its important functions it is the auditory area. And if you remember, it was this one here, the primary auditory area, and the superior temporal gyrus. So that's where the lateral lemniscus goes, finally the relay occurs there. And lesions here give rise to partial deafness, because remember, the hearing is represented on both sides. So there is partial deafness. Let me write that again. So there is only partial deafness. Then olfaction again is another function. That olfaction occurs in the uncal area. So somewhere here in the uncal area is where olfaction occurs. If you go, it kind of goes more medially up there. That's the uncal area. And the interesting thing is that uncal area is very close to taste, and it's so smell and taste are so close by, and maybe there is a site of integration of the two senses that are related to feeding. So you smell something, and then you can taste it better. So it's thought that that's the reason why they are so close to each other. Then memory and thought are again part of the temporal lobe functions, and in memory it is short-term memory. because long-term memory is associated or is present in or stored in all parts of the brain. And long-term memory, or what is also known, these are also known as engrams. And these are laid down over the years throughout the cortex. So, you know, as I told you, I said that you have learned programs that's present in the frontal lobe, in the sensory cortex. You'll have it there, you'll have it with vision, and then of course here in the temporal lobe. And these engrams form the basis of learning at an intellectual level and of skills which are acquired through practice. And while these engrams are being laid down, there are macromolecular changes which occur in the neurons, as well as there are structural changes which occur in the synapses. And Barr, one of the books called Barr, says there is no disease that causes total loss of established memories, indicating that the engrams are contained in different parts of the brain. Rare instances of permanent amnesia which occur after head injury, these are probably caused by failure of the recalling mechanism. You know, you cannot recall how something should be done, because most of the time these amnesic patients eventually recover their memories. So, you know, that memory has not gone away. In people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease, the failure of intellectual function which occurs in them, and in other cases of dementia, this is due to enormous loss of neurons. So there is enormous loss of the number of neurons throughout the cortex, and that's what leads to failure of intellectual function. Another interesting fact is that any event is when it occurs, it is initially held in short-term memory. So anytime anything happens, it's first held in short-term memory, and it may be forgotten during the course of the next hour or so, unless it is moved to long-term memory. So there's a process by which it is moved to long-term storage. The hippocampus, which is present in the temporal lobe, that is responsible for short-term memory. So that's why I said that the short-term memory is a function of the temporal lobe. So this hippocampus retains this information in short-term memory, and then it transfers it to long-term memory. And in order for permanent memory to form, I told you that synapses change, the neurons are altered, and in fact there is formation of new proteins also. So memory itself is a very complicated procedure, and I've just given it to you in a simplified manner. Then the temporal lobe is also connected to the limbic system by means of the uncus, the hippocampus, the parahippocampal gyrus. So all of these areas are connected to the limbic system, and the limbic system is extremely important because the limbic system, which includes the hypothalamus also, it is responsible for functions such as reproductive behavior, emotions, olfaction, nurturing, memory. All of this is connected to the limbic system. So, you know, you can see how the temporal lobe forms part of the limbic system. And then, as I mentioned while we were doing the parietal lobe, this Wernicke's or receptive speech area is also present in the temporal lobe. So it is responsible for receptive speech. And then there's this condition which is called prosopagnosia, which is an inability to recognize faces that resides in both the temporal and the parietal lobe. So it seems to be a function of both lobes, and so people cannot recognize familiar faces. So this is one of the things that is seen when there is a problem in the temporal lobe. Let's go to the occipital lobe, whose main function is vision. And so this the visual cortex, you saw that this is represented in the occipital lobe in its area 17 in the walls of the calcarine sulcus, and the neighboring areas, which are areas 18 and 19, these are visual association areas, and this is where visual memory is stored, where you relate past experiences, they go and get stored there, and this enables a person to associate what they are seeing based on those past experiences. And this area responds to shapes, color, depth perception. Try with your eyes open, it is easy to drop a pencil into a bottle. So if there's a bottle like this and you try to drop a pencil with both your eyes open, it's easy to do that. Close one eye and try to do it. It'll take time to drop it into that. So that's depth perception. So all of this is represented in the visual association areas. So I'll stop here, and then the next presentation will be on the rest of the slides.